Today we're going to be looking at another one of Kyle Hill's radiological accident videos. Specifically this one here called What If You Put Your Head in a Particle Accelerator? Please don't actually try that. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tyler False. I'm a nuclear engineer with a little over 10 years of experience in the commercial nuclear power industry, from engineering to operations to emergency response. I don't claim to know everything there is nuclear, but I can certainly share some knowledge. Let's check it out.
On June 3, 1987, Burgosky was a few meters below the Earth surrounding Moscow, looking after the U-70 synchrotron's detector system with the hopes of eliminating some temporary failures it had been experiencing. As protocol dictated, he called the control room and told the beam operators that he'd be in the experiment hall in 5 minutes. The beam operators needed to know this because in the experiment hall, the main proton beam is shunted off from the main ring and directed through the open air at various detectors. What should have happened next is that the control room should have removed the beam from the chamber Burgosky was heading towards. The door to that chamber should have been locked, and a sign should have been illuminated telling Burgosky that the beam was still very much active inside. But he didn't see any of this.
That is why you have safety postings everywhere. Signage is very important with any sort of hazard, whether it be radiological or otherwise. Keeping doors locked is one important factor. In fact, in radiological controlled areas, there are certain rooms with relatively high dose that are kept locked. And there's even a separate type of briefing for a locked high radiation area. That's just an additional control just because you don't want people wandering in these rooms by mistake. So having a hard barrier is really good. There's also something to be said about human factors for something somewhat routine, because I'd imagine this particle physicist would go into this room fairly frequently as part of his normal job, and he's probably used to seeing a bunch of signs and the doors, but you get used to it, and it's kind of like having a door super saturated. Here's one example for a battery room. So many signs, but if you're doing routine maintenance or a system walk down on batteries, then you're probably not going to sit and read every single sign every time you walk in there. So in a way, too many signs can be hazardous. I just thought that was interesting. Knowing the hazard, talking about it with someone in the synchrotron's control room, that should be done, but again, this was probably routine.
Instead, what he saw was a flash reportedly brighter than 1,000 suns. Particle accelerators are easily the most complicated machines on Earth. They are colossal constructions, the awe-inspiring endpoint of hundreds of the brightest minds, thousands of superconducting magnets, hundreds of thousands of kilograms of liquid helium, and more wire than you can even wrap your head around. The Large Hadron Collider, for example, pictured here, contains approximately 1 billion miles of superconducting wire. That's enough wire to go around the full orbit of Earth, not its circumference, its orbit, twice.
It's funny just to see this sense of scale. Yeah, a lot of wires, a lot of magnetic fields, a lot of things wrapped around. It's a really, really big magnet, is basically how those things work.
The wire in this machine could line a path from the Earth to the Sun and back 6 times. Scientists use the absurdly impressive engineering of these accelerators to study the fundamentals of the universe, the structure of matter, space, and time, and the interactions between atoms and their constituents at their most basic. This is done by accelerating particles through a near-perfect vacuum with magnets and smashing them together at near light speed to record what happens with sophisticated detectors.
These particles are charged, so those magnetic forces, you can just take something really small and with a charge, and you just boost that. It creates that electromotive force that's just going to keep it going. And it's an entire racetrack of magnets going all the way around. And they're in these like quad polar configurations. So it's surrounded by magnets. So nothing's going to slow it down. The repulsive force from those magnets are going to keep it going. It's really, really cool.
Burgosky was intimately familiar with the physics here, and he was about to get closer to it than any human before or since.
That's where he got hit.
Murphy's Law is the adage that anything that can go wrong will go wrong. And the day a high-energy particle beam pierced a physicist's brain, everything did.
My thoughts on Murphy's Law. It's not a law in the sense of this sort of thing will happen. It's more of a mindset that you always plan for the worst and you have contingencies for the worst. It's well briefed on anything associated with nuclear engineering. This should include particle accelerators. I've never actually worked in a particle accelerator, but it's the same physics. It's just instead of making power, you're accelerating something to go really, really fast. You can think of it as a nuclear racetrack.
Bugorski asked the control room to remove the beam in the experiment hall in 5 minutes, but he arrived at the chamber earlier than expected. The automatic lock that should have prevented Bugorski from entering the room was turned off.
That's a mistake. And if that were to happen in a nuclear power plant, that would be considered a loss of configuration control. And everyone would have gotten in big trouble just for that. Even if nothing happened, if the door was found unlocked, that would have been a pretty serious violation of site procedures if that happened at a nuclear plant.
The previous experiment was using a low-intensity beam, and apparently someone thought that locking the door was overkill. In the last line of defense, a single light bulb that illuminated...
If someone thought it was overkill, then sure, have a discussion about it, and and initiate a change request for your procedures and processes. Don't just deviate and say, it's probably fine.
Indicating the danger beyond, burnt out just before Bugorski arrived.
Ooh, okay, yeah. If you're relying on a light bulb that burnt out, you need to get that. Light bulb shouldn't be one of your lines of defense, at least not by itself. But the light bulb and an unlocked door, this is turning into one of those Swiss cheese holes aligning situation where you can put yourself at risk for an accident, which is evidently the topic of this video.
An experienced operator, Bugorski did reportedly have doubts about entering the unlocked door to the chamber so easily, but he proceeded anyway.
Yeah, that's rely on that. If you have a gut feeling, a few reactor operators that I used to work with would refer to it as the hot monster. It's this feeling of dread that you feel both in your belly and a lot of times in your back. Like, oh, this just doesn't quite feel right. Listen to it and get a buddy involved as a backup to say, hey, to ask a question and just to at least give you that mindset that if it is nothing, then you'll at least get you some assurance. I mean, I've seen that happen a few times where nothing bad happened, but there's just this little nervousness that came up, and if it was a little something, you'd be able to catch it before anything bad could happen.
Inside of the chamber, packets of protons were still flying silently and invisibly through the open air, a pulsing beam between where Bugorski was and where he needed to go. And so when he bent down to check the instruments, as he had done many times before, Bugorski was instantly blinded when his head intercepted a particle beam humming with many trillions of protons moving at nearly 300 million meters per second.
Was it like dark in there? I've noticed in this video that it showed like a black thing and then suddenly super brightness, so the lights were turned off. That just seems like a trap. I'm sorry.
The subatomic particles, each carrying 70 billion electron volts of energy, effortlessly passed through Bugorski's brain, skin, and skull.
That's a lot. 70 billion electron volts is a lot. To give you a sense of scale, 200 million electron volts is what is released from a uranium-235 nucleus during a fission in a nuclear power plant. So here you got something 2 orders of magnitude above that. Wow.
According to a later report, he felt no pain. Incredibly, the physicist wasn't instantly killed, as you may expect, but after he saw 1,000 suns, Bugorski knew he was in serious trouble.
Yeah.
Anatoly calmly finished his work in the chamber, logged the visit in a journal, as usual, and then, without saying a word to anyone about the accident, went home.
Dude, why? I mean, okay, is this another example of Soviet Union culture where you don't report anything, you don't say anything, lest you get in big trouble, even if you're he clearly had an incident that's an injury. If it's not an injury right now, it's gonna be in a few moments. Always say something, even if you're not sure. Say something. That's anti-safety culture.
The next morning, after a night of worrying symptoms, Bugorsky was brought before doctors and dosimetrists. The left side of his head was swollen. Translating from the official case history, Anatoly's doctors immediately calculated the dose he had received. Quote, an intense beam of high-energy protons with a transverse size of 2 by 3 millimeters passed along the trajectory. Occipital region of the head, mediobasal regions of the left temporal region, pyramid of the left temporal bone, bony labyrinth of the middle ear, tympanic cavity, jaw fossa, tissues of the left wing of the nose. The radiation dose at the entrance is 200,000 Roentgens.
Oh no. 200,000 Roentgens. So Roentgens are actually not really a unit of dose, they are a unit of exposure. And the main difference is exposure, you're looking at charges per unit mass, because this is ionizing radiation you're talking about. So little electrical charges from this piece of radiation that it is creating per unit mass as it rips electrons off of atoms and causes ionization events. Because that's what it would do. This is a proton beam. Protons are positively charged, so it's going to attract and tear a bunch of electrons off. So those sort of ionizations. I'm not actually sure what the conversion ratio for a proton is, and it changes a lot with energy, and this is extreme energy, so the conversion is going to be a bit weird. They may not have even calculated it, because this isn't typical. Typically, so what normal is like, say, an alpha particle, which is a helium nucleus, it would be times a factor of 20 to go from absorbed dose, which also isn't Roentgens, but it's rads, converting rads to sieverts, which is what it actually does to the human body. And then, whereas betas are in the 1 to 2 range, alphas are in the 20 range, a proton is somewhere in between that just because of mass. A proton is way more massive than the electron, but not nearly as massive as a helium nucleus, a bit less than a quarter of that. But the ultra high energy kind of throws that calculation out of whack. So this is a very weird number to work with. But the low ball would be 200,000 rem or 2,000 sieverts, which is very, very deadly if he absorbed it all.
At the exit, it is more due to scattering on the material, 300,000 Roentgens.
Even more.
In theory, the dose of ionizing radiation that is 100% lethal is just 1,000 Roentgens, 300 times less than what had been apparently absorbed by Anatoly's brain.
Again, just to be fair, 1,000 Roentgens, or it's really 1,000 rem or 10 sieverts, is because there you're actually looking at absorbed dose equivalent by a person. So your 1,000 Roentgen thing, that can be an underestimate depending on what it is, and it likely is in the case of ultra-high energy protons. It's going to be an underestimate.
The magnitude of these numbers begs the question, why didn't he die that day?
Possibly because, so this has to do with a concept known as linear energy transfer, and when you have something that energetic, it's possible it just passed through and didn't impart much energy to his tissue. So his effective dose was way less. And this is an interesting consideration, that because that beam was so powerful, might be the reason why it didn't kill him. If it was a weaker beam, it could have killed him. Counterintuitive.
When you hear a value like 70 billion electron volts, it's a way of quantifying the kinetic energy of particles, the energy of motion. And if particles with kinetic energy suddenly start encountering a medium other than vacuum, they will interact and lose some of that energy. In a biological material like your body, this deposited energy is going into ionizing your atoms, breaking up molecules, creating heat, and otherwise smashing nanoscale structures. Enough of this damage will eventually end any living thing through the creation of cancer or the initiation of widespread organ failure. And so, particles entering a medium bump into matter and lose energy. As kinetic energy is the energy of motion, these many interactions will, as the particle proceeds, slow the particle down and eventually stop it.
And these can be physical things with mass, things with thickness that can bounce around. Since a proton is a charged particle, it could be electric or magnetic fields that could cause some interference as well. Note that that wouldn't be the case for neutrons since they have no charge, but take both mechanical and electrical means of slowing it down.
And where a certain particle will stop is not a mystery to nuclear physicists. It's something that can be calculated. For example, alpha particles pushing through the air at a defined energy will stop after only a few centimeters.
Keep in mind we're talking thermal alpha particles, not accelerated alpha particles. So just like an alpha source, take uranium-238 for instance. This is just alpha particles going in air. No acceleration though, no super magnets in a synchrotron shooting it around though.
This is due to the stopping power of air. Stopping power is a measure of the ability of a material to slow down energetic particles that travel in its interior. Understanding stopping power is very important in nuclear physics, but this knowledge can be practical too.
So this could be a difference. I wasn't taught it referred to as that. It was referred to as slowing down length. But stopping power, as far as like how far it can go and where it delivers its energy, because stopping power, actually think of, like how powerful a bullet is and where it imparts that energy. I guess it's kind of the same idea, but this one you're dealing with something that's crazy, crazy fast though.
It's recently given us a new way to fight the cancers that ionization can sometimes cause. When a high-energy massive particle like a proton moves through matter, it will lose energy as we said, but more specifically, its energy will diminish in inverse proportion to its velocity squared. Therefore, a proton will deposit the majority of its energy in a material right before it stops.
I'm with him now, just a bit of a terminology thing. Yes, so it would have a slowing down length, in this case of, 23 centimeters, and then it delivers all of the stopping power as far as what's delivered at that specific length. Cool.
This is what nuclear physicists call the Bragg peak. And if scientists know how much an energy a particle will lose and where it will be lost, then in theory a particle beam could be directed to enter a material and disrupt or destroy only a certain volume of that material. Well, this is exactly what so-called particle therapy does. Heavy particles from a small accelerator are pointed at a person's body and lose almost all of their energy at a calculated distance inside and no further.
Proton therapy is a thing that uses this exact principle. So it can be very precise. This is actually a really cool type of cancer treatment, and it's less invasive compared to a external beam therapy that saturates an entire area, or brachytherapy where you put something like an alpha source at very close range. That one is more situational because there's only certain orifices you can go into without messing with stuff. So for things like brain cancer, it's a cool application.
Particle therapy at its best can even pass through a person's skull to damage and destroy brain tumors non-invasively. Anatoly Burgosky's brain effectively received the most overpowered particle therapy session in human history. And so again, why didn't he die? The answer is the Bragg peak of the beam that he crossed and the stopping power of human flesh. For example, look at how far a beam of protons will travel through water, a similar density to human flesh, at an energy 300 times less than what Anatoly experienced.
Yeah, it puts all of its energy far away.
Only around 25 centimeters or a foot. Your head is likely not even 25 centimeters in depth. Therefore, the protons in this graph would not dump all of their energy in your head. They'd pass right through it. And even more powerful beams protons would then be able to travel even further before stopping.
So, in a way, this was a bit of luck. If he held his hand in front of his head or something like that, or even did kind of a brace for impact pose or something, it could have his arms could have slowed it down a bit more or something. So really, he just happened to be in a spot that wouldn't kill him.
Anatoly's brain matter literally did not have the stopping power to bring the beam's high-energy protons to a stop and to create a Bragg peak inside of his skull. This is why Burgosky did not even come close to receiving the full dose that the U-70 synchrotron could theoretically deposit, and that is why the actual radiation dose was so small, nowhere near hundreds of thousands of Roentgens. That he crossed the beam in the way that he did, of course, was pure luck, as was the path the beam took through his face, missing critical brain areas and blood vessels. Still, the fraction of energy he did absorb was enough to change Burgosky's mind and body forever.
That's just, because anything with the brain, so not a brain expert, but there's so many areas that could be critical to being able to move, being able to talk, and just that regulate the control of certain organs. It's possible if he could have been standing a couple of centimeters more to the left, it could have killed him.
Few staff in the ICU thought Bugorsky would live, including Angelina Guskova, a pioneer of radiation medicine in the USSR and the same woman who headed up the treatment of every victim of the Chernobyl disaster. But with her overseeing his treatment, Bugorsky did indeed recover. However, what those treatments were, how long each took, how Bugorsky recovered specifically is unknown. Everything, every document and report, every statement and testimony related to his treatment was immediately classified.
Of course. Not at all surprised for trying to cover something like that up.
Though Anatoly had survived an incredibly dangerous situation, his personal Chernobyl had only just begun. After a proton beam blasted through his brain, hearing in his left ear completely disappeared. He started having epileptic seizures. Any mental effort was accompanied by extreme fatigue. The nerves on the left side of his face were destroyed, freezing his expression in place there for the last 43 years.
Yeah, anything involving a brain injury is going to mess with a lot of stuff like that. I'm not surprised to hear that.
And when he concentrates, only half of his forehead wrinkles. The decades following Bugorsky's accident were not easy. Though the physicist was able to defend his PhD in 1980, which he prepared before the accident, obtaining the medicine and treatment he needed was a bureaucratic nightmare. In the Soviet Union, so-called radiation patients were only legally recognized after the Chernobyl disaster in 1986.
That's interesting, yeah. Any other radiological accident before then didn't happen, but the one that the rest of the world figured out because we ended up setting off high radiation alarms in Scandinavia, that one, okay, I guess we got to do something about it. Crazy.
This meant, again, according to the Ecological Truth Organization in 1998, quote, "The entire material side of the cost of treatment and other compensation for damage to the health of victims is somehow legally related to Chernobyl," end quote. Bugorsky therefore had the right to compensation and benefits established by the law of the Russian Federation for, quote, "the social protection of citizens exposed to radiation as a result of the Chernobyl disaster." But of course, Bugorsky's health had nothing to do with the actual Chernobyl disaster.
Yeah, and that because they made it for Chernobyl specifically, that wasn't a recognized radiological accident. Oh, that poor guy.
The specific wording on the documentation for his radiation disease said nothing of his unique encounter with a particle accelerator or indicated that he was part of a select few with similar injuries.
Of course not. They don't want to tell people they had another radiological accident.
It simply said that Bugorsky had experienced an accident.
Wow.
Eligibility revoked.
He could have an accident. He fell off a ladder and hit his head. Wow.
He did not speak publicly about his accident for over a decade, but talking with Wired magazine in 1997, the year his health was put into his own hands, Anatoly Burgosky said that he would like to make himself available for study by Western scientists and presumably have his health looked after by them, but he admitted that he didn't have the money to leave the science town of Protvino or leave the particle accelerator underneath that passed through his brain like it was barely there. "I am being tested," he said. "The human capacity for survival is being tested." Until next time.
Another very well done video by Kyle Hill. I'm glad I can offer some additional insight on that. This one was one that I wasn't real familiar with. I find it crazy that after all he's been through, so in a way he got lucky in the sense that it didn't kill him, but the whole trying to get the healthcare coverage nightmare. And of course, what ended up happening to him anyway. Very sad. And again, preventable. A lot of these accidents, like the ones that Kyle talked about with orphan sources, were very preventable. Chernobyl was preventable. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.